Well, I want to welcome Jordan Belisle to the Controversial Exchange, TCE. This is both a delightful occasion for me, Ryan, and Danielle because we get to talk to a person who's very much in line with where our heads are at. But it's also a little bit somber because it's going to be the last full tilt episode we do for a while.
That's right. We're
Um,
gonna get into that as like a final episode that uploads later. So
Stay
we'll
tuned.
get into that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll be doing a full tilt thing, but this is special because Jordan is doing work in some very interesting modeling areas that I think, even if his theories don't pan out, just the sheer fact that we're thinking like this really provides opportunity for growth and scale and understanding and just the ability to touch more lives through this behavioral perspective that we talk about. So rather than talk about who you are, Jordan, I'd rather just let you kind of just introduce some of the highlights that you think people should know about you.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much. I'm really appreciative and grateful for you guys having me on here. With a lot of the work that I'm doing, I already feel that I'm way out of my league and punching above my weight class. So this is an exciting moment. I guess, yeah. So I grew up in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, which was awesome. I graduated from a program that was almost exclusively focused on behavioral psychology. So all of my classes were in behavior analysis, behavior science, a lot of practicum and stuff. So that was really cool. I moved to Southern Illinois University, did a bunch of work with Mark Dixon for 5 years. And towards the end of that work, not that things weren't exciting in the earlier parts, because we did some really cool stuff like developing a peak relational training system. Together, we published like 40 peer-reviewed articles over the course of that time together, which is pretty wild. But towards the end, what started to happen was we were doing so much of this research. And what we were noticing was that the kids that we were working with, clients without autism that we were working with, even in observing our own behavior, it seemed to be the case that language and cognitive structure seemed to emerge in the absence of any reinforced contingencies. And so relational frame theory, kind of as we understood it, didn't seem to be completely sufficient to explain some higher order things, for example, like relational schemas and that kind of stuff. And so that drove us into a totally new area of research where we developed together this thing called relational density theory. We put a couple of papers out on that. I'm not going to spoil the ending because I think we'll get into that here quite a bit. But it also made us kind of reflect inward on like, what is science? What is behavior analysis? Where are the limits? Are there limits? Should there be limits? Why are we imposing limits on ourselves? Can we shed the straitjacket? That kind of stuff. And yeah, so really those questions are what have now guided me through my first 3 years as a professor, and hopefully several more years, assuming, everything works out and sleepless nights don't take me too early.
Well, I think so why don't we just get right into it because we've talked a little bit beforehand, and I'm just too excited and I have too much stuff in my head to get out in the little time that we have. So I'm just going to start going, bro. Let's talk about models because, and I just want to preface kind of the conversation a little bit so we can have a little bit of a string to pull on here. When we think about models, conventionally in the field within the context of the verified course sequence and within a basic radical framework, we're always kind of limited. I already colored myself here, but anyway, we're pretty much married to a 3 or 4 term contingency. If you want to get wily and you want to add rule governance, you can say there's a 5th term. But we're really in this very linear, closed feedback loop of how behavior changes, and it specifically focuses on points in time. And it doesn't have a lot of prediction to it. And if the predictive is it's automatically determined, so there's not a lot of room for uncertainty. So from a model perspective, what kind of led you to start looking at models differently? Was it just your training in RFT, or was it just because it's fun?
Well, it's certainly fun. It's certainly my training in RFT. I don't know. I mean, everyone kind of has their own model-dependent story. And I guess for me, there were a few converging events that mattered. And so first, I was incredibly interested in relational frame theory, obsessively reading everything I could about it, working with Mark Dixon to develop Peak, a whole technology to teach kids with language, to teach relational framing with kids. And so we were doing that whole thing. At the same time, I was becoming more interested in just sciencing. in general, science as a behavior that people engage in. And so I started to read more in physics, mostly about scientists who study physics. So Hawking, deGrasse Tyson, Feynman, Molodinov, those guys. And just their approach to science seemed so fascinating to me, because I would say one common feature across those guys, and a common feature from the way that I think we were approaching relational frame theory at Southern Illinois University, was almost like a science without constraints. It was a science that defined no limits to what it could accomplish. Rather, the model itself, the behavior of the scientist, was the only limit that seemed to be imposed on science. And so that really got us talking, like, what is science? And we talk about science as some sort of like absolute thing, but it isn't. And what we arrived at is science is the behavior of the scientist. It's a set of rules governing the behavior of the scientist. And what is a rule? Well, a rule in many ways is a model. And so what you can achieve is somewhat constrained by the model that you're working with. And some models are vastly successful in some contexts, but then fail in others. Different models then may achieve success in that new context, though fail in the old context. And so within the model-dependent realism thing, that's what we talk about in terms of context dependency. And so it's not some absolute model. Like, behavior analysis isn't a 3-term contingency or a 4-term contingency. It's saving the world. And whatever model allows us to do that the best is the one that we stick to. And so that's kind of where we've been taking this whole thing with model-dependent realism and relational density theory and so forth.
Well, that's pragmatism kind of at its finest, right? That's rather than going to what once was derived from a pragmatic perspective relative to whatever data was available. It's saying, okay, the data shifted, or at least the questions we're trying to answer don't fit within this model. So let's pull back to our default position, which should be pragmatism, and say, okay, what is the type of model that would potentially provide an explanatory framework for what we're seeing in the data and represent the natural world around us? And I think it's amazing that you went towards the physics route, because one thing about the 3-term contingency that, Skinner was, radical behaviorism when we're talking about private events, and that shift away from methodological behaviorism is great, but the 3-term contingency still kind of operates within a materialist framework, right? So it doesn't allow a lot of space for those interweaving relations of nonlinearity or non-linear factors that create uncertainty. So and that's kind of, I think, where RFT breaks it. Because I think the real thing with a model is once you hit a certain point in the science where you break your model, that's where your reassessment comes into play. But I think we're in this situation now where we almost have the equivalent of a quantum versus Newtonian divergence.
I think
and
so
we
too.
need a behavioral string theory.
Right. Well, yes, a behavioral string theory. And we got into that with that model-dependent realism paper. And when Hawking and Molodinov talk about model-dependent realism within the field of physics, they talk about really 2 things that are important. One is, can we have a set of rules about models? Like, what makes a good model? And they point to 4 things. So elegance, is it testable? Is it parsimonious? And on the parsimony thing, I think one misunderstanding is that I feel like sometimes when I talk to people in the field and they talk about parsimony, the way that they talk about parsimony is coherence to Skinner. Shockingly, the rest of the scientific community does not define parsimony as coherence to Skinner, nor is parsimony how much can you explain new problems with old equations. Parsimony is, does it make the fewest assumptions? Does it have the fewest number of terms? And so anyways, parsimony is something that we strive for in all of science. Then also scope. So can your model account for all of the data, and where does it start to fall apart? Now, string theory is an attempt to now unify these models, right? To bring all the physical models together. And so when I presented this paper to Perspectives on Behavior Science, somebody much smarter than me was a reviewer on the paper. And I had a whole section there about M theory and like a unifying principle and how it'd be really cool to find one. And they were like, I think we have one. And I was like, okay, what? And he's like,
what?
The operant. Yeah, he's like, the operant. And so think about it. So if we take all of these models, right? We take the 3-term contingency. We take Skinner's verbal behavior. We take relational frame theory. We take relational density theory to scale it up. We take naming theory. Every single one of those come back to one unifying principle, the operant. We do it because it helps us to survive. We do it because of context reinforcement at a differential rate. And so we continue to do it. And can you take something like relational frame theory, if you stick that in the behavior term, it's still contained within that 3-term contingency. Just the B part is a heck of a lot more complex, I think, than we've ever really understood it to be.
Okay. Ooh. There's a lot in that. I don't know if I don't know if I actually buy that. Like, I'm as far as the operant being the unifying component, I think that it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. So when the reviewer pointed it out to you, is that something that you were like, okay, I now like subscribe to this right now, or
yeah? Were you like, yes?
It's in the paper. Yeah. I mean, I was convinced. Yeah. Why do you not agree with it? What additional complexities do you think come in that aren't then also accounted for in terms of operant?
Well, because it's kind of like it still assumes determinism to the extreme. Like, it still kind of presumes this like purely deterministic framework where if you did have all the variables, the world is a pool table. And I don't know if I agree with that. Anymore. If you would have asked me that 5 years ago, 3 years ago, hell, even a year ago at this point, I think I would. But I think at this point, getting into statistics, getting into all these various models, getting into trying to account for uncertainty, I don't know if the level of complexity that exists in the world and the level of variables and the way that they can be arranged leads me to the belief that based on the biological limitations that we have on our ability to make sense of the world, that not having a model that assumes pure determinism already a priori sets us up for failure in the long run towards an actual theory of everything.
Okay. I tend to agree with that. However, when you talk about randomness or when you talk about chaos doesn't occur in a vacuum. Chaos occurs in a context. And if we take something like, if we go genetics just as the operant being an extension of evolutionary theory, mutations at some level are random, but mutating itself is non-random in the sense that having that variability within genetic structures allows for species to evolve under new pressures. So when we look at behavior too, randomness, certainly. Probabilistic responding, absolutely. Uncertainty, the rule, not the exception. I agree with that completely. But then I think that is a presupposition to variability, and variability being something that's the key to survival, ergo contacting those reinforcers. And I think at some level we see that with kids that we work with. And so if we reinforce stability, we eliminate that chance, we eliminate the variability, you can predict behavior fairly well. But then you end up with these robotic children. Big problem.
So that's where I go back to Gold Diamond, and I start thinking about how could we get to the point we could start quantifying decision making across n-1. So what does it look like for degrees of freedom, and like providing choice, like what is that threshold? What is that line to where we like? And I'm not trying to make an agency argument because I know that's like a total faux pas routine, right? But I'm just saying that like there seems to be, regardless of what our models and what our philosophy wants to tell us, that there is a certain degree of something going on there that we're not necessarily accounting for. And it makes it, even if it's illusory, it's there. And we're not necessarily explaining that correctly.
Dimitri, I agree 100%. I love you. I think you're great. I think that we're totally
this
on the
man
same
crush
page with
is
it.
developing both ways.
That's what I mean by like the B term. And I think like so much of our model, so much of our analysis focuses on the A and the C, right? We focus on that external vacuum, but we don't look at the behavior as the self-organizing system. And that if you want to make predictions of how that system's going to evolve within that context, I know you can't, I'm making motions with my hands and I understand you can't see them.
We
totally can.
Watch the video.
We do
keep
keep
the video
man,
up
I
too.
should have made my hair
we're on
better.
YouTube.
That's okay.
Sorry, we do keep a video version. It looks great.
But anyways, so you have the behavior occurring within a context. Most of our models assume the context to make the prediction of the behavior, but ignore the present state, what that behavior looks like. And when you take complex, self-organizing, dynamical systems where chance plays a considerable role, you need to know where the system is right now and how far out can you generate that prediction. Well, you can do it a little bit, but then there's error. And so that error makes it a little bit harder to predict at the next phase of evolution, a little bit harder to predict at the next phase of evolution. And so we can't make far out predictions, and we certainly can't really make very good localized predictions if we don't have an understanding of B. And so relational density theory, I think, is that. It's an attempt to model what's happening in that B term. It's a measure of behavior.
Then let's get into it then. Why don't you walk
One first quick question though.
Oh, sorry.
The degrees of freedom, nonlinearity, like at what point or did you ever dive into Gold Diamond's work? Did you jump into that nonlinear behavior analytic approach that he developed?
No. It never really came up, or not at least when we were developing the model, but it is something that I want to explore. And so right now we're at like the phase of this thing where we're trying to just run like basic experiment after basic experiment to vet the model, to see its bounds and to modify it and so forth. But I think another step is now seeing where it converges, for example, with Gold Diamond's work and outside of behavior analysis too.
Okay, yeah, we'll bring that up at the end then when we're done off air. I want to chat with some ideas and potential people to talk to about that.
100%. You're going to have to go outside, because that's what like Danielle and I have been having to dig outside. Like when COVID hit, and basically, we saw the equivalent of, the level of social revolution and just upheaval and conflict and just like existential crisis and lack of meaning and all that stuff kind of put us in this way where like I couldn't quite, like, I understand multi-level analysis and I get BOM and all that stuff, but then when you try to actually do a comprehensive cultural macro level analysis, you get into this like esoteric conversation of interlocking and macro and meta contingencies that is it's philosophical to the point of ungrounded, and it doesn't start to actually it's
not satisfying at all.
It's not satisfying, and it lacks that parsimony. It lacks that elegant simplicity that you want in terms of your explanatory framework to actually possess to be useful. Because if you have to have a doctorate to understand your model, it's not good enough, in my opinion.
Right. And you're adding terms exclusively to seek model coherence. And again, it's a bizarre definition of parsimony. I think you're right. And I mean, another example too with relational frame theory, just as an example that people might be really familiar with, is for entailment, where people are like, oh, but we can account for that with a Skinnerian model if you do all this private stuff in your head that you can't see, can't prove, can't test, can't falsify, but it's happening. And look, if we distract people, then they can work on the
It's like a sleight of hand, right? You're like Houdini them into just buying what you got to say.
Exactly. And it's like, okay, but if I distract a fish, it's also going to perform worse on the operant task. And I'm not convinced the fish is engaging in covert verbal behavior. But the point is, even if true, you've taken this outcome that we've already shown, which is entailment, and now you've added about 10 different terms to get to that same end. And you achieve model coherence, I guess, but at the expense of a parsimonious model of if I teach A equals B and B equals C, they derive that A equals C and C equals A.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing, right? We're in it for truth, right? And truth explains the natural world. And if we're trying to explain the natural world from a behavioral perspective, we're trying to provide a theory of human everything, really, not just, I mean, physicists are concerned with material reality. We're concerned with experiential reality, really.
Right. We're concerned about the truth in a context that our models can describe, and then sorting out the different models that can actually achieve that, right?
So let's get into relational density, man. So why don't we start breaking that down a little bit for people, because I think that it's a pretty tough paper to read.
Yeah, it was a tough paper to write.
I bet it was.
I saw that coming.
All right, so here's the thing. So if someone took you and put you on this purple planet where, I don't know, like the river's in the sky, there's no trees, there's these weird balls floating everywhere, it's bizarre, and you're the only person on that planet, I'm guessing that you start to make sense of that planet in some sort of way. You start to name things, you start to categorize things, you create stories about things, you form to some objects and not others. You're like, oh, these are my bubble friends, but we don't like those bubbles over there. You create this verbal world around this purple planet. And part of the problem is that even within a relational frame theory account, certain relations have to be reinforced. You have to reinforce A equals B, and you have to reinforce B equals C. Now, granted, A equals C, C equals A emerges. That's great. But where did A to B and B to C come from? And so relational density theory, part of it is asking that question, what if nothing's taught? How do you make sense of your world in the absence of any external force? And the answer hangs out in physics already.
Plato's cave? Is that what you're basically doing?
What's that?
Sounds like the behavioral equivalent of Plato's cave. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Oh, yeah, the allegory of the cave. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, the allegory of the Jordan. I don't know. Yeah. So where does that come from? And physics handles this problem too, where although, yes, like an external force can be put on something, like you could strap a giant rocket to a planet to get it to move. Most of the time, the force is exerted by the system itself, which is literally what they're referring to when they talk about things like gravity, inertia, momentum. Inherently, it's about how physical systems change. And so that's kind of where we started with this relational density theory thing. And we actually do have what we call like a dynamic model of behavior already, which is behavior momentum theory from Nevin, Shahan, and colleagues. And what's cool about this is it goes past just talking about behavior as a count, rate, or some sort of static variable, but it talks about how behavior changes or evolves under pressure. And so the equation that they talk about, change in behavior equals force over mass, mass being the resistance of that behavior when you apply force. So extinction, punishment, whatever, counter conditioning, when you try to move the system, how much does it stick as like an initial model? Now, when they talk about it, where does mass come from? And of course, you know, like everything in behavior analysis, it's from a history of reinforcement, right? Because that's everything. It's the catch-all answer. You can win any argument by saying, well, it's in the history. You don't know what the history is. You can't really make a prediction because it's not there, so you can't measure the history, but whatever, it's fine. It works. The problem is with verbal behavior is that so much of it occurs in the absence of a history of reinforcement. By definition, rule-governed behavior at some level is insensitive to the actual contingencies that produce it. The whole idea of emergence within relational frame theory, a lot of what we know was derived without reinforcement, so it gets pickly. And so we just dug deeper into the equation. And so what is mass? And so mass is volume times density. And we already have terms that we're familiar with that talk about volume, or the space that something occupies. And that would be, for example, like the nodes that are contained within an equivalence class. So how much is there? How much space does this relational frame or this relational class occupy? And then density, how tight together are things? So how strong are those connections? And so if you think about like a concept or an idea that you have, how many how many class members are in that frame, and how tightly together are they? How strong are those connections? And that's what we use to estimate mass. And then when we go back into the research, the experiments that I ran as part of my dissertation and now are published in JCBS, what we show is that that's predictive of how much that system moves when we start to counter condition. And so when we throw in new information, or in the current context, misinformation, how much does that disrupt the system? And the current mass of those relational frames tends to predict how much those relations move in response to that external pressure. So the system itself is exerting resistance in this case, relational resistance.
So that's number one. So cool. Okay. I mean, like, so cool. However, though, it still begs a question. Is that there's still a presupposition of emergence or not? There's a lack of explanation for emergence. What is that singular momentary moment of emergence in and of itself? It's a coalition of all those things. Like, how do we account for that relative to other things and relative to other things emerging, right? So there has to be this account for that dynamic process across the board, right? And I'm not sure if that what is it? Like, what is that thing? What is that fundamental unit that if you pull your microscope and you keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, you know, almost like you would in physics, where you basically provide, in my opinion, that's like a Newtonian explanation of bodies moving around the solar system. And only that provides a relational system in and of itself, correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
Right.
If I keep moving in though with my microscope, there's the way that relations can become seemingly, not seemingly, they are arbitrary by definition, at least within RFT, right? That they're not as orderly as that, though, really, in real time, are they? Or am I misunderstanding this?
Exactly.
So, like, wouldn't the notion? So, like, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that, like, there seems to be more of a quantum explanation that is necessary, or at least an analogy that would better fit even more to provide, like, what is a particular emergent unit of a frame, or whatever we're going to call that response thing, you know?
Yeah. When we look at complex systems, you're right, like, we tend to go inside of it first. And if we just stick with kind of the standard equivalence, or even the standard relational frame theory account, what we end up is we assume all relations are equal. all relations are equivalent. There's the same space from A to B as B to C, assuming that they have that same history. We're not accounting for how maybe this relational frame over here pulls on this relational frame over here, and how this relational frame theory over here, or relational frame here, pulls on this relational frame over here. And what that does is it pulls on all of the relations. So now it's no longer this isolated relational framing in a vacuum, but in your entire like relational history is pulling on various aspects of it.
And that to me sounds more like particles appearing and disappearing and existing and non-existing at the same time.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that sounds to me more like a quantum equation than it does like a Newtonian equation.
Well, and they're not indistinct, because what happens with, like, you need Newton to get to the three-body problem and Poincaré's solution of that three-body problem. And so for you guys who are listening who aren't familiar with that, if I have two planets that are orbiting together, predicting the orbital movement of one planet given the other is pretty simple. I mean, not simple for me, probably not simple to anyone who's listening to this, but if you're like a strong high school physics student, you can probably do that. If you're a first year college student in physics, you can make that prediction well enough. Once you throw in that third planet, things get messy, because the error produced by that first planet affects where the second planet ends up. The error produced by that second planet affects where the third planet ends up. The error on the third planet affects where the fourth planet ends up. And then the whole thing goes to chaos really, really quickly. So this first step, so relational density theory is the first step. It's not the end game. It's the first step to even have that Newtonian model of relational resistance and relational gravity, and how relational frames pull on new information and new frames that are presented. That's the first step. Now, at some point, that model, even knowing what those frames are, becomes unworkable. Because if I ask you about your deepest held beliefs, then I say, what of those were trained, what of those were derived, and how much is this thing related to that thing? It would be immensely challenging to even start to model that. So it's interesting. It's almost like we've already planned for the death of our own model, but we need a vernacular, we need a starting point to then get to the three-body problem, to then come up with a solution to it.
This reminds me... Sorry, Frank, go ahead.
I was going to say, what are some of the real world questions or things that you want to start trying to apply this to? Like, can you paint a picture for viewers of like how this connects to the real world that we're living in day to day?
Let me give you, I'll give you at least two. So cool. One is an area of research that we've jumped into. So my lab right now is myself, and then the people in my lab are exclusively female, which is of no intentional design, just that's generally the makeup of the field and where things have emerged in this moment. And they're very passionate, and should be, about the disadvantages that women have in our society, and how stereotyping and those types of relational frames adversely affect them in pretty much every single area of their life. And these guys are will be immensely successful scientists in our field. And so it makes sense that there's a lot of frustration that comes from them in that. And so one area where we've started applying this is in the area of gender stereotyping. And the way that it works, at least in the experimental designs that we've been piloting, is this. So we give you a set of relations or words that have already kind of a gender class ascribed by the society, right? And so we'll pair two feminine words together, two masculine words together, a masculine word and a feminine word, and we show that people relate those differently. So they pair the feminine words together, they pair the masculine words together, and then there's more space, there's less density between the masculine and the feminine words. That's not really a surprising part, but it kind of shows that you can model these things. But the next step is, now when we give you a story about four people, one person is exclusively, or one person is presented exclusively in terms of these feminist relations. Another person is presented exclusively within these masculine relations, and then two other people contain mixed or ambiguous relations. Now, when we go back and test this, and the person's name is also presented, what we're seeing is that they pull the gender consistent terms closer within them. And even when we have stereotypical terms in the questions that they've never been presented with that person before, those terms also gravitate towards the gender class. And so it's interesting. So it seems to be like even knowledge that you've never been presented about a person seems to gravitate towards that person based on the already stereotypes that you've created.
Behavioral entanglement, my man. That's what you just described. That's what I hear.
I'll put that in the paper.
I'm serious though, because I think that. All right, I'm going to give you a crazy idea for this. Is how insane I am when I'm on my free time. So whatever. So this is totally unflushed out. I've literally just been screwing around on my own time, like at midnight alone, just typing. I think that if you take Schrodinger's equation and you try to account for relational frames and find behavioral analogies for spin, position, momentum, I think it could account for that particular thing, like through a model. Because I think that's where it leads, because it at least provides a certain degree of it provides to account for the certain degree of uncertainty that goes with that, and then it also allows for the spectral response that you're looking for, right? Because it's that gradient, it's that range of the way that those types of things emerge and how they exist in time relative to each other. Because it's more point to point movement rather than this like anchored level to reality where it's like we assume these giant momentary, like we think the environment is so fixed and controlled, but that's really not how it is if we're talking about the world of relational frames. So like things emerge and come in and out of existence. You have superpositioning, and like it's kind of like, and this actually goes with this thing that Shahan published where he was talking about reinforcement and questioning it even as a principle, and he was talking about the reinforcementness of a thing, and it's almost as this like mystical force that we apply when we explain it as a thing rather than just a process. And it makes me I just get jacked about it, because I think that might be a very nice and analogy and framework that we can model, that we could actually start accounting for these things and put them in a without falling to all the reification stuff that people get a hard on about, because that's where I think that we could get some substantive measures on it.
I love the alternative to an IRAP, like, you know.
Woo!
And that's the zoning out. And it's interesting, right? Like we gotta, zoom out to start to do something workable with it. But what's cool is that it brings us back to like Saunders et al. 1988. And what they showed was that if we create these equivalence classes, right? And then we give you the symbol, but we don't reinforce if you put it with class A or class B, you just do it. Then look, now when this symbol is now related to other things, you get the class merger, but you never had to reinforce that. And half the participants would go one way, half the
exactly. It occurs. It just happens, right? Like it exists and doesn't exist at the same time.
But if we have information about those competing networks that show
we
up
can predict it.
Mass, exactly, probabilistically, not perfectly, but maybe it's a 70% chance you go left versus right. And if we talk about something like stereotyping, I think that's relevant, because we're not talking about absolute stereotyping. No one's like, oh, well, you fit this mold, therefore this is you. But it's a probabilistic position. And it's in my best interest to assume those stereotypes because I'm right more than I'm wrong, potentially.
And it has a quantum quality. It has a quantum quality because you can almost say that it exists in this kind of like potentiated state, like a wave. And that when you measure it, it becomes matter. So you can actually see it and identify it and put a number on it. So you can account for both the way it exists outside or before it actually occurs, relative to when it occurs as well. And you can kind of bridge that gap without having to appeal to some outside mentalistic forces that you can't actually explain, or just history is just a throwaway presupposition.
Right. And it sucks if you're the thing being related and the relational frames are not in your favor, such that people don't relate to you as a leader, for example, because you are a female who exhibits these feminine characteristics, because we associate masculine characteristics with leadership. And so it's immensely harmful, but it also gives us the solution of how to potentially dismantle it.
I just have to tell you that I've been chewing on this for about 6 months, and I've had no one to be able to articulate it. And I've been literally growing borderline schizophrenic insane trying to make it work out in my head. So thank you for that. I feel very good right now. This is so amazing.
Vindicated.
It's not vindication because it's not vindication. It's not vindication because it's not been written down or anything. Oh my God, I think my mic was off. But it's definitely. It definitely has the potential to provide some interesting ability to account for these nonlinear events that are frames, ideas. I really don't know what the right word is anymore. That don't fit within the framework cleanly. That's so amazing. Because like even Einstein wrote about the same thing where he called them spooky particles or whatever, spooky relations, and it's kind of like that within what Shahan's talking about, and it fits within what you're explaining too, and it actually does have a quantifiable account. So this
Right.
is cool line of research around, man. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Like
Yeah,
amazing.
it's been a blast.
Potentially revolutionary. Seriously.
Well, and then if we have time, I'd love to dig into a second.
We got plenty of time. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Yeah. So recently, about a year ago, we started working with this 12-year-old girl with autism. And when we started working with her, for you guys who are familiar with the peak relational training system, she showed some symmetry in her relating. On the peak transformation module, she was hanging around like level 1, level 2. So she was engaging in some really simple relational frames. So we ran peak with her for a while, and we see an improvement in her relational abilities. But with that, we started to see some really interesting things show up. And so we're teaching her about different, opposite, comparison, those types of things. And what we start to see is that she's using these terms and relating them to herself and her own experience. But where that started to go for her, where that started to kind of gravitate towards as a pattern of relating, is that I have autism and that's a problem. That's something that's wrong with me. I'm different. I can't figure out the same things that my friends can figure out. I have a really hard time making friends, and it's so easy for them. And it was interesting because as she starts to go down this path, and it's something that I don't think you would get to see almost like evolve real time, except for with somebody where language is really just starting to show up for them in that way, is that what she's relating to in terms of her autism diagnosis and those frames of distinction just start to become more and more pervasive. And it starts to become eventually everything. And just the way that she relates to the world verbally is necessarily through the prism of her own frames associated with autism. And so seeing that evolve was fascinating. But the thing is that it wasn't just about disrupting those frames. We can't just say, nah, you don't have autism. But it's about adjusting how those frames are evolving. So framing, the pattern of framing is a self-organizing behavior. And so if we can disrupt that, if we can move it, if we can change the functions of it, then we might have some success. And so we started to, do a bunch of kind of the acts. The solution's always act, right? And so eventually you get to the solution, which is act. But what we had to do to start to disrupt those frames is like, okay, so what are some things that you like about yourself? Would you be willing to get rid of those things that you don't like about yourself to get rid of that autism label? Sure. What happens to those things that you do like about yourself? And so we're starting to pull in those positive things within that autism frame as well. And kind of as the semester went on and as she's interacting with this stuff, she starts to think, could I help other people with autism to start to see the world in a positive kind of way? And so again, noticing those patterns of relating as they're self-evolving, I think matters.
I think what's key about this to take away is that as we're moving into wanting to shape these types of perceptions and these perceptions in the world, because I think that's the push, right? The push is to look at this, to take into account a lot of these social realities, a lot of these contextual variables, etc. But we lack necessarily the tools and the effective models to do them in an empirical way that doesn't lead us down some philosophically twisted perspectives. And it kind of does reconcile and bridges the gap between like scientific realism and whatever subjectivism, postmodern constructivism that you're in. And you have both accounts there that make sense because you can account for the subjective, but you can put it within a realist perspective in terms of material reality. And that matters significantly because that's what makes it scientific. That also makes it grounded. It also makes it measurable. It also makes it objective. It makes it less emotional. So I'm just, man, so excited to hear somebody talking like this. I got to tell you, it's amazing. Sorry, you guys got anything you want to jump in on here? Because I feel like I'm just like,
no, I'm along for the ride
about all these things.
I'll speak up when I'm ready.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, Jordan, let's keep rolling, dude. So what else? Where are you in terms of like where are we on density? What's the next phase for density?
Yeah. So right now, we're really focusing on that translational stuff and then also continuing to refine the model. A piece of advice that Dr. Dermot Barnes-Holmes gave me, he was on my dissertation committee, so he was actually a big part of shaping this. A piece of advice that he gave me was that it's not about proving or disproving your own model. That's not the point. New data come in. The data are going to support or they're going to falsify parts of that model. The answer isn't, oh, well, the model was wrong. The answer is to then refine the model in light of those data, retest, and continue that process. And so that's what we're doing. And so the basic equations that are presented in that paper, I mean, it's a difficult paper to read, but once you get it, it's pretty elegant, I think. It's pretty parsimonious. But it's also incredibly simplistic. And that model, as stated, probably doesn't actually account for very much. So what we're working on is those basic experiments to continue to refine the model so that it can account for more and more things. That's where the translational research, such as things on stereotyping, gender stereotyping, racial stereotyping, where does religion fall in? That's interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, polarization in general, right? The thing is that we need to account for how beliefs happen. Like, where do these anchoring rules that govern people's lives actually come from, and to how can you possibly modify them so that they don't create this extreme, I don't know, very, very because it just conflicts with the way people think about this stuff just publicly in general, right? And within a 3-term contingency, you get to this. You get to a really bizarre outcome. This changes that very much fundamentally. Do you? So, what other fields have you been tangling with other than physics? Have you been looking at other kinds of models or other types of fields in the way that they look at these types of dynamics?
Yeah. So I was hoping we would get into convergence.
Go ahead. Let's pause on that and go in convergence, man.
Yeah, we have no agenda and plenty of time. So, at any point, just grab the reins and run, man.
Yeah, man. I think it feeds off of it. And the idea here is that when multiple discoveries or multiple technologies from fields start to converge on the same answer, that's when things get really exciting. And so the stuff that I'm kind of we're figuring out, my lab's figuring out, other labs are starting to test, are converging with discoveries in neuroscience as well as in AI, in the area of dynamical systems, as well as neural connectionism. And so what's fascinating, for example, if we take like an AI system, you have your input layer, you have your output layer, and then you have that hidden layer. The input isn't directly equal to the output. It's similar to when we use the 3-term contingency and just try to predict behavior using that external, what we know about the external world. It doesn't work perfectly. We need to understand that hidden layer, the black box. And when you look at weight variables that show up within networks, they tend to act in that same sort of way, where certain relations or networks or nodes within the model exert greater weight than others that direct where the eventual output of that thing is. And so in some ways, AI is already like doing this. They beat me to it by, probably a decade at least. So that's kind of cool. And then in the area of neuroscience, I mean, what they're showing, for example, is that the amount of brain, the dendritic connections, that kind of stuff, you can actually look at the density of connections that participate. For example, when I present you with a word, if it's an arbitrary word, not very much of your brain is involved in dealing with that stimulus. However, if that word is something that participates in an equivalence class, for example, more of your brain participates in it. And there's research showing up in stimulus equivalence showing the difference between neurological responding when presented with a directly trained relation versus when presented with derived relations and so forth. And so I think if you want like a neural mechanism to some of this stuff, it's there. And so again, we're seeing the convergence of this work. So the question, what am I getting into? I don't know, I guess everything, whatever. When science shows up, just reading about it, and I guess kind of interpreting it in terms of these frames that I'm building, I'm no different. It's all the behavior of the scientist.
Yeah, I love this idea. I love this, getting to the point where we can start predicting the emergence of, derived relational responding, actually know what kind of responses will be coming in the future, at least with a certain degree of probability. There's this guy at Ohio State named Alexander Wendt. He's a political scientist, and he wrote a book called The Quantum Mind and Social Science. And he provides kind of a quantum consciousness account where I think it would be interesting for you to check out, because he looks at it more in terms of he starts out from a macro perspective, look at nation states as individual actors and runs it through those types of games. But he runs them through those equations, and it's pretty interesting. You should check it out, man.
Yeah, well, I'd be fascinated to see those equations. And if it's anything like the neural connectionism stuff, when you get the equation, it's interesting because if you do enough like transformations with it, if you really sit with like the terms that are in it, it somehow ends back up at Newtonian mechanics. And I don't know, totally fluffy, not scientific at all. I'm going for a hike the other day, and right, you get into the middle of the forest, there's a greater density of trees. Even trees themselves exhibit it, right? Like they're dense, like in the middle, and then they become less dense. Eventually they have branches that branch out. And so, I don't know, like if you're looking for a universal principle, and there's some work on that, a lot of discussion on that happening right now, sort of in the field of physics, does it all come back to those Newtonian models at some point?
Is there any social modeling that you've done, like relational networks and stuff like that too?
No, I have colleagues that do, and I want them to be my friends.
Because
where do you see the connections? I'm curious. Like what?
Well, it started out with this idea, like so. I found this paper by this guy named Grieslinger. It's older, like social gravity theory, and he you're raise your hand, say it.
I like that name. Yeah, that's great. Social gravity theory.
Yeah, and like he provided, like he wanted to do more like use those particular, just use the equations for gravity and those Newtonian equations to explain population movements and patterns, and why certain populations move from one area to the next, and what are the influences for that, and how can you predict for it. And he looked at just population density as mass and treated that as a behavioral variable. And it was just really fascinating. It kind of fell apart and got abandoned, but I think just as an idea, I think that was a thread that I wish I would have liked to have seen go further. And I feel like you're the first person in real time that I've been able to see actually publishing on that kind of stuff. So that's, yeah, I was just curious to see if you looked at the relational networks and that. Because there's interesting statistical models that they do, right? I mean, that's how, Facebook's built. That's how Instagram's built. That's how they're all built. So it'd be interesting to see if you get your hands on that stuff and if you just start plugging in massive amounts of data, what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is fascinating. And I think when, like, I don't know, I feel like at some level we need to collectively start to understand and deal with these discoveries that are happening in these other fields. I think it's hurting us to be so isolated.
100%.
Right? I mean, physics, biology, AI, all of this stuff is related to what we do. We are physical beings that exist in a physical universe. We're biological organisms, and AI can behave like us. So probably their models have some predictive utility in terms of what we do as well. But I also think we're at a crossroads as a science. And so what do we do with this complexity? Do we extend our science and allow these complex models to kind of show up and guide where we go? Or do we stick with some of the old stuff? And I think if we can move forward with these fields, that's great. We can do so much. We can experience that model convergence and go where no behavior analyst has gone before. The risk is that we get caught up in our own dumb rules again and see these things and say, oh, that's not behavior analysis, or Skinner never said that, and we missed the boat.
So how do you prevent that?
Publish, write about it, understand it, read about it. And I think when new things show up, don't immediately dismiss them. And I think we have a history of doing that. And twice, right? So one would be the PBIS movement. And so PBIS showed up, had the potential to be immensely successful. We dismissed it. It was immensely successful. And it was immensely successful without us. What if we could go back in time and correct that? We would have the school system. We would be in the school system. You have a school system that has challenging behavior. Who do you call? It's like Ghostbusters, right? You call the behavior analyst who's going to come in and embed some cool PBIS system. Now, of course, the model imperfect. The model would be refined over time. But we would be kind of leading the charge on that. But we missed that boat. And it happened with RFT and ACT. And so RFT shows up. Here's this crazy new way to talk about language that we've never ever talked about it before. And here's a technology called ACT that can deal with things like depression, anxiety, and so forth that show up. And here it is immensely successful. And we're like, oh, no, that's not behavior analysis. That's not the pre-term contingency. And we let it go. And what was the result? And again, it converged with other fields, just like how PBS converged with education. ACT and RFT converged with mental health, social work, clinical psychology, and they moved forward with it. And the result is that they're treating those problems, not us. And so we missed the boat. Imagine if we had the education system and mental health as the areas where they sought behavior analysts. And I think the result is if we continue to do this, we remain obscure, being able to solve the same 5 or 10 problems that we can already solve. And eventually profound forms of autism have a cure, or these convergent fields figure out how to solve language better than we can. And I think that's probably how this all ends unless we adapt.
I have to say though, one thing about this is that like the level of sophistication of these models is pretty big. And there's only enough bandwidth, to distribute across disciplines. And the question then is our discipline fruitful enough for people with the level of bandwidth necessary to do that, to effectively allocate their time in that way?
Or do they leave?
That's what I'm saying. Because honestly, Danielle and I are on our way out. Like, I'm done with it. Like, that's why we're gonna, because I think that the frustration that comes from this is going to be totally interpretation, but I would say that there's a general frustration in the field as a result of everything you just described, right? People are tired of being pigeonholed. But we don't have the sophistication in models. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the institutions to necessarily produce people with the training and skills that can even begin to talk about the world like this, unless they are purely obsessive lunatics who lock themselves in their basements with books from other disciplines and try to learn this stuff on their own and kind of sound like a jumbled mess like I did a couple times during this podcast, which I do unabashedly because I really want to learn this stuff and I find it fascinating, even if I sound like a moron at times. And like, that creates a particular condition to where the energy gets pushed towards a different direction. And I think people are moving a lot more towards, social validity metrics and like these like the idea of advocacy as action and as evolution of science. And that creates a conflict between, how do you progress versus how do you have impact, and not seeing those things as actually one and the same. Because that's, I think, what you're describing. You're describing as impact through progress, and that's a hard thing to get to. You had mentioned before, I'd heard you mention before that you blame the institutions kind of for producing this kind of mindset. How do we bring this about? How do we get the institutions on board for real? Because that was my frustration as well. I dipped my toe in it just to see what it was like.
You create your own small private sector that creates it for you. You have control over. That's it, man. That's like that's why they designed Silicon Valley, and those tech startups are succeeding is because they said fuck everything else. Let's build it ourselves. Mm-hmm. Right? Like maybe go study in this class in Berkeley to learn about how psychology influences human behavior, but then come back here because that's all you need to soak up over there.
Well, in all fairness though, like to kind of build off that, like if we have a Silicon Valley, at least historically in Reno, and so the folks at Nevada, Reno at the time when RFT and ACT and stuff were taken off, I mean, shoot, they were just like, we're going to do this whole different brand of behavior analysis that's radically different from what the folks in Florida are rocking out. And what's the result of that? I mean, if you look at the leadership boards, for example, of Applied Behavior Analysis International, I think, if not all of them, most of them are graduates or professors from Nevada, Reno. Mm-hmm. And those guys, a lot of them have then gone on to start their own PhD programs. From those PhD programs, I came from one. So mm-hmm. Dr. Mark Dixon, Dr. Ruth Ann Rayfeld, both of them graduates of Nevada, Reno, then taught Kyle Rousey, Caleb Stanley, so forth. And we go out too. And someday I'd love to have a PhD program. And then who's going to gravitate into those programs? And it's people like us who are going to come into those programs, start to discover and craft these new problems, go out and produce their things too. So I think we got to do the work on the front end. We can't get too tied up on the failings of everybody else, but just kind of do the work, and hopefully we exert our own gravity, so to speak, and pull other people into the space. And for that kid, that undergraduate kid who's brilliant, who's like, I don't know if I want to go into behavior analysis because it seems kind of kooky, really contrived, and really simple. Maybe they read one of the articles that we write, and they're like, maybe there's something here, and I'm going to go study with that person. And then we start to pull in the smart kid. And once the smart kid gets in, and I don't know, I was definitely an average kid at best. So once the smart kid comes in, that's when we start to do some damage. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that the system self-evolves and that we can exert enough force by working very hard to push
disrupt
it forward.
The system.
To disrupt the system. Yeah, be the gadfly that bites the horse in the ass. Can I say that?
Yeah, yep. We're the explicit podcast. I should have told you up front.
That's the mildest thing ever on this.
Yeah.
That is phenomenal.
It's just Dimitri's motto, just do it better. Just do it better than everyone else.
Do you think we just get selected out? So are we at the point now where we don't have enough variability in the system? There's not enough mutations happening. There's new environmental pressures, and we're just going to die. What do you think?
Honestly, I'm kind of feeling that way. I'm feeling like we're going the route of social work, sociology, and the other social sciences.
I think the overall practice of behavior analysis is definitely diverging, and the majority of people are probably going to end up that way. However, I think what you're going to get, just like you saw with the ABI, ACBS, is like you're going to get a core group of people that are kind of like, we want to form it and start chasing this direction, which is essentially what you were, in my understanding, what you were just describing and what is going to happen. It'll be a very small proportion of those people, but it'll be the right people. But what I mean there is the people that largely understand what the larger goal of behavior analysis was, and is, and should still be, which is, like you said, saving the world, like actually fucking creating solutions, like create solutions.
Well, and one thing that I take personally from, I got this advice from Dr. Barnes-Holmes, but I saw Mark Dixon live this, which is you don't get to take your foot out of the clinical world, right? So like this relational density theory stuff, I think it's pretty cool. The model-dependent realism stuff is cool, and I do, and I spend a lot of time on it, but I don't get to take my foot out of actually solving problems. And I think once you completely like remove yourself from that world, you end up solving models for model's sake. And that's not the point. The point is to affect different change and eventually to create technologies that solve new problems. And I think as long as you're willing to be in both worlds all the time, that's where we can get that bigger impact. I mean, relational frame theory was cool, but not that many people cared about it, at least in behavior analysis, until something like Peak came along. And it was like, here's a technology that you can use, that your teachers, that your paras, that your RBTs can pick up today and start using with kids. That really started to skyrocket. And similarly with ACT. And so using RFT to solve clinical problems, cool, but then ACT shows up. And now suddenly people are into it because it's something they can use. And so I think that's one thing that I'm passionate about, is not abandoning that applied sphere, but making sure that there is that bridge between me and them.
Which is pretty refreshing.
So I don't know if this segues us at all, but what I see happens though is there's like, to what extent do those get implemented correctly, and like what's the cost of packaging those technologies like that? So what are your thoughts on that? Like once you start to get this Peak or ACT, like people look for a model task analysis set of like some sort of simplified system. Like how do we solve that? Because let's start there, and then I've got something else to add.
Yeah, what's correctly? What's correctly is correctly the prescribed structure that occurred in the initial book.
I feel like, okay, so I feel like you get a lot of pliance instead of tracking in those situations, right? So you get a lot of people saying like, I need to follow this Peak program to the T, rather than like this was, it's very prescriptive instead of this was the starting point.
They don't necessarily understand all the theory behind the creation of the
And the point
curriculum.
there is like, I think great practitioners are always engaging in this like tracking over the pliance, right? And what we do is we tend to move over as practitioners into those realms. And I don't know if that's just like a natural phenomenon or byproduct of like creating these models, but like,
I'm not as concerned as being sensitive about this. I think there's a superficial level of sophistication in relation to the understanding of relational frame theory in particular, where people understand mutual entailment and combinatorial entailment, and they kind of think they understand transfer of stimulus control, and they plug it through their own personalized framework, and they produce this bizarre interpretation that is not necessarily consistent with whatever, and in all fairness, in my opinion, minimal basic research really to substantiate it so that it can actually springboard into a natural science version of it rather than a social science version of it. So there, I'll say it more bluntly.
So I wonder how much of like, is this an issue, for example, in like the medical sciences as probably like the extension of the basic biological sciences? And so the average at best doctor probably understands what medications to prescribe given a certain illness. They might not understand the intricacies of all of the chemical interactions that are occurring within that. And so for a lot of problems, they're effective, but then obviously they hit their limit and they can't really solve new problems. That nuanced case that shows up, that specific form of illness, they can't adapt because they don't know actually the physics of how that thing works. But then you have better doctors who are more versed in the basic scientific theory, who can start to adapt the medications, who can start to pair medications, perhaps in ways that aren't in the literature explicitly, but make sense based on how chemically those things interact. Even higher up, you have people who can create new medications because they understand so intricately the chemical interactions at that level and so forth. And I'm wondering if what happens here isn't necessarily the death of the behavior analyst, but almost more of like a layering of sophistication and complexity, and as a function of that, the types of problems that any given behavior analyst can solve. And so those much more advanced in it are the people who end up probably making more money because they can solve that case that no one else can. But where something like Peak or AIM or other technologies like that show up, TARPA, et cetera, are that for those behavior analysts who are in that middle range or who are evolving their skill set, it allows them to work with a lot of clients and achieve successful outcomes. And I think that's an empirical question. Do we get those results? And that's where a lot of the research that Dr. Dixon and myself have been doing, and Dr. Palalunas and Dr. Stanley as well, where what happens when we run something like Peak after giving staff 6 hours of training on relational frame theory, no additional reading, but we do teach them how to run the Peak programs. Do we get the IQ gains, for example, that they see in the lab? And it seems to be the case that those same IQ gains show up, the same gains on the standardized tests of language show up. And so that seems to be sufficient to produce that, at least in most cases. And I'm guessing the sophistication accounts for some variability of the implementer.
Cool. I'm really interested in the development of like these professional skill sets and like where things will go. So like in 2013, I went to an ACT boot camp and I was talking with Steve Hayes, just like me in a small group or maybe one-on-one, I can't remember exactly, but it was like after the presentation. I was like, if you could kind of wave a wand and correct one thing, like what would you have done out of all of this? And we got onto the ACT peer-reviewed trainer system, and he was like, that was almost too tight. Like it wasn't quite allowing enough practitioners to get in and scaling as fast as they were wanting at that point. And I don't know if he still holds that position, literally 7 years ago, but what you're describing there of having, differentiated system of depending on what problems you can solve, like you were essentially classified differently, like that looked like where they were going to go. And so, like I look at practitioners that way, like what problems can you solve? And it seems like whatever it is, you start to pump out stuff in PBIS, RFT base, ACT base, like you get so far and then it starts to just get watered down. And that's that consistently happens unless you have a really intense continual review process. So if you're someone like in Fit Learning, where they make sure that your acceleration gains of the student you're working with have to be within a certain envelope window. And if they aren't, you lose your certification or you do not get your, like that seems to be the level that's required, which is just such, I'm okay with personally, but seems to be very intense and like against some of the things that we've already established early in our training systems, which is like you are the BCBA that gets to make the decisions, like it's just a fascinating area for me. And I feel like the coordination of some of these type of questions and creating solutions here is like how we're going to potentially recorrect the practice of behavior analysis. I don't think it's going to necessarily happen because most of the infighting and shit that goes on, but it's what's required because I see someone like Fit Learning, and I don't know the intricacies of like what you all are doing there with Peak Training, but like that has the potential, I think, to actually scale a technology without losing the important components that practitioners are supposed to be behaving with respect to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one thing that I return to is, okay, so let's take the high school guidance counselor, just as somebody who might be utilizing behavior analytic technology, but certainly isn't an applied behavior analyst. Does that guidance counselor do better, for example, running a curriculum or technology developed by behavior analysts that contains these essential ideas, but obviously repackaged in terms that make sense to that guidance counselor? Is that better than without? And if it's better than without, are we going to restrict it and say, well, no, it's got to be this absolute perfect version all the time? The result is that there's 1,000 people who can do it. Or do we open it up, kind of like Steve Hayes and those guys did with ACT, and create those technologies that are usable, measure the impact when those people go and use those technologies against randomized control groups, which they do at treatment as usual, and demonstrate that the impacts are achieved that they're looking for. And they're not as impactful, say, as if Steve Hayes himself was running these ACT sessions with that high school kid. But maybe for that high school kid who's having a problem with a small dosage of bullying over social media and is upset about that, maybe that's enough. But for that kid who's struggling with that so badly that they're considering taking their own life, now that's something where the person with the much more sophisticated knowledge of how relational frames operate
Okay, so I feel like the potential, the only way to really sidestep this is to leverage technology and be able to actually model out, predict, and like provide these dynamic treatment models at levels that clinicians just can't simply do.
Resistance to change.
I'm coming off of they did a Tech B does this conference. It's a University of Miami based, like 5 presenters this week talked about technology and its applications. And generally speaking, like I think that's the perception that all those speakers held, which are folks like David Cox, we've had on this podcast, Joe Lang and others, that the only way we can potentially control for quality issues as we scale is through technology. Do you think about this sort of realm or agree with that?
And technology that's adaptable in context, I think. And so one thing that really drew me to the work that Mark was doing with P was that it ends up being scalable. And so if your knowledge of RFT and verbal behavior is somewhat minimal, but you can run the programs, is that better than the special education teacher or the paraprofessional who's trying to teach language without it? Probably. That is good, but it's not like the low bar or nothing. Once you have that knowledge of relational frame theory, you're probably adapting your programs in various ways, and it's flexible enough to allow you to do that so you can get at those deeper intricacies of relational framing. Even now with some of the research that we're doing, can we take those peak programs, plug in some of this relational density theory stuff, and actually model like self-organization that occurs within those programs? And so it's sufficiently flexible that you can do those things if you need to. And I'm guessing that the complexity of the case that you're able to tackle or the gains that you're able to make are positively related to your knowledge of those principles and your ability to apply it within a technology.
Or the ability for something like AI or machine learning algorithms to be able to do that for you, essentially.
Oh, if they could run it themselves. And so we've been doing, not that sophisticated, would love to get there. But with a site, which is what we've been working on, is how much can we standardize this stuff? So can we gamify, Danielle, these peak programs so that it already embeds those relational learning operands, already embeds some of those self-organizing principles within the context of the game. Now the staff member, what they need to know is how to reinforce and keep the kid on task. And their basic training in behavior analysis allows them to do that. The game itself kind of contains those technologies in it, so they're learning in that way as they interact with the game. The person just has to get them to play it.
Well, and a good game should really be motivating enough to get people to play without that teacher in some ways.
Absolutely, yes. And so they just need to make the game accessible at that point. Yep. So maybe technology, I agree, definitely provides one of the answers to that. And I guess in medicine, you package it in a pill. And so is that kind of what we're proposing here, is that the super experts package their technologies in a better and better pill that has less and less susceptibility to error?
Yeah.
It seems, yeah.
The simple answer is, my issue, I do take issue with using medicine or even law or those really professional grade who get even a classification if you check a box on a demographic survey, relative to what we do. Because I think that the caliber of education, the rigor, the expectation of performance and expertise is a bar set at such an exclusive level rather than inclusive level. And I don't, in terms of how one must be in terms of their scope and competency to actually be permitted to take on that mantle, that it's apples and chainsaws. It's not, we're not even both fruit.
Is there a new bar? Is there an additional layered bar that could be created though? When we're talking about graduate training programs and like holding them accountable for this stuff, is there a new designation? The BCBAD, what does that open up for me beyond the BCBA? Nothing at all. But is there an additional designation that could denote like this person can solve these complex problems where others can't? I don't know. I don't even know what that would look like. What do you guys think?
I think off of purely like hunch and kind of seeing how the APA formed and wanted clinicians being at the PhD level, I think it'll progress to the point that we need to differentiate this. And it'll be a really hard thing for the field to handle, but it's going to have to at some point come down to that if we want to. I think that's the potential avenue to try to recorrect some things and like help get the field back on track with like we can solve these hard problems, or it just stays where it's at and we kind of devolve into like the social work realm and stuff.
Well, we had a conversation with Kim Barron too, and I think that Dixon's done that with Peak in terms of a technology, and I think Kim's doing it in terms of like like an institutional idea. And I think the notion of disruption is missing from how I think we can get to where we want to go, and that goes back to the Silicon Valley analogy that Ryan made, and I think it goes back to kind of some of like how do we solve this problem because. If you go back and look at it, what this really is, it's like trying to realize the dream of transforming education from this very, altruistic, wonderful place where it's like, how do we make it so we're producing people that learn? How do we make it so we're producing people that can effectively get socially significant outcomes to better human life? How do we make the world a better place? And as a result of trying to do that through this hyper cooperative, collaborative position, it puts you in a position to run into counter contingencies and institutional barriers that actually are primary drivers and restrict your ability to provide what would necessarily be actually effective. And because you start getting ideological disagreement, you start getting disciplinary disagreement, you start getting regulatory restrictions, and so then it's like, why even participate in that system to begin with? Fuck it, turn your back and do it differently. It's like, how about instead of trying to change what that is, just do a different version of it and just make it die on its own because it's inherent. Because as a person who works in public school districts, public schools now, like I can say fundamentally, like I knew this intellectually and academically that they were in rough shape, but seeing is believing, and it's astonishing isn't even enough of a word. I have a tendency to be hyperbolic, and I can't find a word that would put me in a position to be accused of being hyperbolic for how bad it is. So I don't know if repair or even being able to interject anymore is worth it. At some point in time, there's a gambler's fallacy going on where you just gotta, or sunken cost fallacy where you gotta, cut tail and do it differently. So
you're talking me into it, Dimitri. I'm out.
And I think that's where we contrast because you seem like the eternal optimist.
No, but it is interesting though. Like, I mean, I think
you
get what you put out, and so I get students. I mean, historically, our program has been a lot of master's students who want to work with kids with autism, doing kind of the applied behavior analysis thing as they exist status quo. But more recently, over the last year or two, since I joined the department, what we're seeing is more students coming in who want to do things other than autism. And what that's forced me to do as a kind of professor who wants them to live the life that they value is to kind of like, how do you even get a job in those spaces? And it's interesting though, because you can, but who you're competing with isn't behavior analysts. Who you're competing with is people from other fields. And in a lot of these fields, it seems, they don't care what your master's degree is in. They care that you have a master's degree. And so we qualify as that.
And a skill set.
What's that?
And a skill set.
And a skill set. Can you do the job? Can you get those outcomes? And it's interesting because once you get out of the behavior analysis bubble of these weird kind of rules that we created, you get into selectionism again. And now they're going to take the person who can solve that problem well and do our weird rules allow us to solve it better? And this is, again, interesting. So if we stick with just the 3-term contingency model as we've been hanging, our students aren't very competitive in those spaces because the other fields that don't follow that model can generally solve those problems better than us kind of following strictly these rules. Well, but if we can produce scientists who can use these models, these new models in different ways, are they able now to solve those problems and step into those spaces? Again, behavior analysis itself being irrelevant, being trained in a behavior analysis program being pertinent.
Well, I think that our disposition to over-program to the point of ridiculous and keep doing that tool component analysis to get to that small micro molecule unit has put us in a situation where like we've restricted ourselves in a downward slope almost rather than an upward trajectory. That's an interesting, I agree with that.
Well, and there's a lot of... Go ahead.
If I read another paper in Java or BAP or any other journal where it's like, okay, we wanted to see which prompting was better, and so we got 3 kids, and look, this one prompting method was good for 2, and this other one was good for 1. So I don't know. I guess it depends on the kid. If I see that paper occur again, Dimitri, I'm going to be so upset. But I think it's that. It's like, can we molecularize this so much? And then the outcome's always the same. It depends on the context.
Behavioral skills training.
Can I switch gears real quick? Sure. And I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I read a blog you recently wrote, and I thought it was so well done.
Is this on ABI or something?
No, you wrote America is a Frame.
Yeah, the erosion of America.
you wrote a blog post, and I thought it was such a wonderful. No, I swear to God, I think it was such an attempt to really break down this from a behavioral perspective and what it means. Would you go into that a little bit, just as a side note, because I think it's just such a great way to use relational framing skills to look at broad scope ideas that aren't in our normal typical conversation.
Yeah, I haven't read this. I found it. We can link it for folks, but can you describe also as a start what you put in there?
Yeah, so if you guys are anything like me, the stuff that's happening right now in the United States is terrifying. And I don't know if it's just me being Canadian and now living here, where like I just haven't experienced this before, but so you guys who have lived here like your whole lives, is this normal?
It's terrifying. You're not alone.
I'm
Yeah,
quite
no, it's
happy to be
definitely
above.
terrifying.
It's quite entertaining up here. Not
We've
being
already
down
planned
there.
our escape route. It's going to be on Vancouver Island.
You guys can come live with
Yeah,
me.
man.
It's like living on top of a meth house, right?
I literally started building a
It's like living
trench
on
in
top
my
of a
basement.
meth house.
We're expanding down here.
That's
I'm going
definitely
full
a way to
tilt
put it.
Bill Gates like underground layer scenario. I'm sorry.
Right, yeah. Get the bunker, get the guns, do what you got. I mean, it's wild. And so there's kind of two things here. One is that I want students to see that some of the stuff that they're learning about actually does potentially have application or a voice in understanding what's happening in the world around them. So it's not like this kind of cute model to get kids to talk better. But it's a whole way of understanding the way that we relate to the world. Now, if we follow that logic through, there's one problem here. And America, I think historically, and I get at this at the blog so you can read the details, but has historically been a hierarchical frame. A hierarchical frame means, although things are different, they're still contained within the same class. And so you get the transfer of function happening somewhat consistently. So in this case, Democrats, Republicans, both contained under the umbrella of America. Thus, the transformation of function is that we should treat them as human beings with things like basic human rights. The problem starts to happen. What happens if we take away that hierarchical frame? What happens when we remove it? Now, I think what happens in America is you have that hierarchical hat, and then you have Democrats, Republicans, and they're in a frame of opposition. And so far as that hat is there, everything's good. But what we're seeing, I think, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of discourse, in terms of social media bots going in to disrupt the system, which is totally wild, is that they're pulling away from that hierarchical frame. They're disrupting the hierarchy. And if you take away that hat, you're left with frames of opposition. And the problem is, and basic research shows us, is that transformations of stimulus function get really scary in your frames of opposition. And so if I say that I'm a person, I have rights, I have inalienable rights, you can't tell me that, you can't kidnap me off the street. You can't tell me I can't protest. You can't tell me I can't have guns. You can't make me wear a mask. Suddenly those same rules don't apply to the other person because they're not American. They're not a person. They don't have rights. You can take them off the street. You can take away their guns. You can lock them up. You can take away their right to protest. And so what you end up with is this weird treatment of the other person as if they're not a person. And so I think that, again, the relational frames matter quite a bit. And that extends off of a paper that myself, Dr. Paolunas, Dr. Dixon, Dr. Tarbox wrote about some of the rhetoric used within presidential addresses, where we compared the rhetoric of Donald Trump, Obama, Clinton, and Bush. And what you see is a very high frequency of frames of distinction occurring within the rhetoric of our current president, which I think is just, again, strengthening that opposition. And so that's problem. And then the second part is social discounting, the probability that you'll give stuff up for you to benefit other people. We published a study showing that when you're experiencing economic hardship, your social discounting curve tends to steepen. And so the pandemic creates economic hardship. You have the erosion of this hierarchical class, all of that stuff co-occurring. And what's the solution? And so I think part of—
I wonder what the hyperbola looks like. I wonder what the hyperbola looks like for real under these conditions. I bet the discounting in comparison to what it would actually look, what the trend would be, is pretty out of control.
Right. Like even the toilet paper thing. Like I'd rather hoard 50 things of toilet paper so that you can't wipe your own ass. Yeah. I mean, it's wild, right? And that's, one example, but I'm going to hoard guns so that I can shoot you in case you try to take my toilet paper later. All of that stuff's kind of wild. So I don't know, my Canadianness is coming out, and I'm just like, I'm a little worried.
Not that there's not
We
Canadians
are
up here
too.
that feel that way too. There are a select few, but
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just thought that that's an interesting take on it, because that's really what it is. It's like, to put it a little less technically, it's almost like the erosion of the notion of a shared, of an agreed upon definition of what it is to be America, and what fits within the confines of that in terms of discourse and belief and identity, creates the conditions of turmoil and chaos, because opposition in and of itself just pushes it's literally polarizing forces, pluses and minuses. It's magnetic forces pushing against each other farther and farther away as they collide, and it creates bigger and bigger explosions.
And it's due to like a centralized leadership essentially pushing that agenda.
Right. And then there's an option, right? I mean, I think that divisive rhetoric serves a function. It gets people elected. And so then they have power. They can use that power to pay back the people who gave them money for their campaigns. They can keep some of it for themselves and whatever. So they profit financially from it. But the risk, of course, is, again, that erosion of that hat. So you could almost apply within the delayed discounting framework. The smaller, sooner reward for politicians is to erode the hierarchy and get the votes. But the larger, later problem is that you might not have a country later when you go to collect those profits.
Did you look back into, has this been something that, do you think, could be applied to other erosions of different situations, past countries, etc.?
Possibly. Okay, so an example, just to kind of like feed off of the social dilemma, and again, I'm just kind of trying to remember things on the spot, but
you good, yeah.
I believe it was Myanmar.
We're spitballing here now. Let's go.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
to the listener, we're just talking now, so let's just all take a breath and let people speak, and not everyone get a home.
And just for quick context, the social dilemma is just looking at how social media platforms have been designed basically off of a lot of behavioral principles and other areas to completely squeeze the most out of us, and to what degree is that sowing discontent and pushing people apart, right?
Yep. So in Myanmar, from what I understand, a lot of their news comes from social media, so things like Facebook. Massive disruption occurred there essentially by placing bots into the social media system that basically is there to strengthen those divisive or oppositional frames. And so if I'm searching on specific pages or sites, the Facebook algorithm puts me in those sites. Now, what seems to be happening is that people are then placing bots or fake people in those sites that are basically there to reinforce those relations or reinforce those frames of opposition, to erode that hierarchical frame. The result of that in Myanmar, because they also didn't have a free media that was feeding alternative perspectives, was this massive kind of revolution against Muslims. And so what you ended up with was people killing others because of their Muslim faith, and eventually the mass exodus of Muslims from Myanmar. And so there's some intentionality to that erosion again, and the social media self-organization via the algorithms and bots that are there to basically use reinforcement against us. Is another layer of terrifying.
Yeah, it's insane what's going on here. Go ahead.
On the inverse of that, I wonder, how do you strengthen that? How do you strengthen that? How do you unsteepen the curve? How do you get the curve going the other way?
What was interesting is the first one they presented in the social dilemma, I think, is actually Arab Spring, and talking about how social media kind of created the conditions to allow for the overthrow of a regime, right? But then was that kind of the precedent of like, oh, this could actually be used both ways, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a double edge to every sword, right? And how do you change it? So I don't know. One thing that myself, Dr. Caleb Stanley, and a couple other professors have been kind of working on is there like this weird contingency at play? And we've just started some basic research on it, so I'm not saying this is like causal whatever, but since we're spitballing. So here's the arrangement, right? So you sit down, you press a series of buttons, and the faster you press the buttons, the more points you get in the game. Okay, whatever, simple enough. It's a boring task though. So all things equal, you're just gonna press slowly. So condition one, you're gonna get one ticket in the lottery no matter how many points you get. So people press the button slowly. It's a non-contingent reinforcer. Phase two now, you're in a group of 10 people. You're in a group of 10 people. The number of tickets you get in the lottery is the number of points you get in the game, divided by the average number of points of the group. And so it's interesting. As an individual, your best bet is to press the buttons as quickly as possible. However, that's true of everyone. Yeah, exactly. It's true of everyone. They drive up the average, and now you have to press quickly, even just to get that one ticket. So now you're engaging in an insane amount of effort just to get that same reinforcer. Whereas if there was some sort of collectivistic, like top-down control or rule, or you had the ability to touch base in some sort of way throughout it, you might establish a rule that says, okay, let's all click at some sort of rhythmic pattern so that we all arrive at one ticket. But
it's
then
again,
again,
it's almost like a mixed model prisoner stag hunt. So it's like you're looking for defection and cooperation. Yeah, it's fascinating.
exactly. And how do you find defectors, and what do you do with them? And so I think, and it's an area of sociology and so forth. I'm starting to work with a member of our department to understand it a little bit better. But yeah, I think understanding those contingencies and how they work and how to disrupt them might give us some answers that could bring us behavior analysts into that arena a little bit. I mean, reinforcement seems to be what they're going with for social media manipulation. It makes sense. The algorithm's based on stuff that we discovered years ago. But can we also be the group that discovers the solution? And that would be really cool. So if anybody's listening and is like, man, I think I know how to solve that, that would be a really cool.
I mean, that's literally what I want my dissertation to be on. So that's I'm going to talk to you after this. So I would love to talk to you because social discounting, delayed discounting, probabilistic discounting. That's kind of where this road is taken, I think, to make it behavioral outside of like relational framing, because I think that's just not where I want to be. But I would love to. I would love to talk to you more about that.
Part of the reason
that's an interesting game you have.
Part of the reason I just got in this whole internet life was just so fascinated with the potential to influence and like trying to understand how that digital world works. And I still don't fucking understand a lot, I feel like, but it's fascinating, man. So few people realize, like the one from The Great Hack. Did you watch that as well on Netflix?
No.
So
It's a good watch.
it's
too.
very in line with The Social Dilemma. Definitely check it out. But it was highlighting Cambridge Analytica's role in social media, and there's statements from them that there was over 200 elections from midterms to presidential across in which they influenced 200 elections from 2013 to 18, I think, was how long the company was formed, and then completely disband and everybody ran to different islands to hide because of the controversy and issues that they caused. But like 200 countries' elections within 5 years because of exploiting a hole in Facebook's data that they allowed people to contact.
Well, and bottom line, and this is something that I think all behavior analysts should be considering, is that essentially, like, from this moment forward into the future, you will never have a client that isn't interacting with and isn't affected by social media. And maybe that's an individual with autism. Maybe it's a teenager experiencing depression and anxiety. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's an organization, or maybe you're diving into this stuff to understand social politics and voting and that kind of stuff, whatever. But whoever your client, social media is a massive, massive part of their environment. And it's a rapidly changing and evolving set of stimuli that are designed to impact behavior, specifically to impact consumer behavior so that you buy products. And so it's a fascinating realm that, I don't know, I wish we had more research as a field, understanding the very complex, intricate interaction between us and the AI algorithm that shapes us.
They have a lot of those types of games, though, in poli-sci and economics. A lot of those games. There's a lot of that stuff.
Folks, it's one of those things as I learned more over the last few years. Like, for example, YouTube, I think this is accurate still. It was never like stated by YouTube, but it apparently came out of some of their engineers there. So I can't verify it, but YouTube was apparently every 5 seconds creating a new profile on your consumption behavior. Every 5 seconds.
Jesus.
Isn't that fucking unreal when you talk about a dynamic behavioral stream of data and influence?
You should poop in your pants just thinking about that.
and even if that's after every video you click, that is still unbelievably like unfathomable. Like that it is the largest semi-controlled, not controlled fucking operant chamber ever.
Well,
in economic terms, it's the most it's responsive to revealed preference in immediate time. It's the most dynamic framework I could think of. It's amazing.
When we were
It's the
talking
best.
about different master's degrees and you really just need a master's degree and a skill set, I think that's one skill set that needs to be incorporated into true behavior analysis is like this understanding of big data and models and those pieces of things, because I know that that's what we've been looking at postdoc fellowships and things like that, or just positions that call for a PhD in something like behavioral processes, and they all require this understanding that we wouldn't even get in a doc program because it's out of our scope.
That's part of the reason this is why we're pausing and wrapping up the podcast is like we've all come to the point and realized like we need to severely spend time in developing skill sets and understandings in areas if we want to pursue behavior analytic visions like Skinner and others had laid out on saving the world with behavior
And I think
analysis.
part of that comes to what contingencies are we setting as well. And so, for example, ABAI creating a grant to explore these things, making that grant competitive so that people like me, people like you guys are all competing in for this grant to then maybe hire a master's student or a PhD student who participates in that grant with us to explore that complex topic over the course of time. I mean, that starts to incentivize those types of behaviors. I mean, shoot, the daily BA, right? You guys are rich. Put a grant together, change the world.
Let me tell you about making money on the internet, man. It's kind of like academia, and if you do it right, you can afford yourself a lot of time to explore the things you want to do, but you're probably not going to be rich. Now, unless you're, I guess in academia, you might be able to land some really solid grants over time, start pulling in some cash that way. But I'm very, part of the reason I got into this was I think it was off of learning about Ogden Lindsley's research interests and like how he developed his lab was essentially kicking ass in the private sector. He did have a big boost from a inheritance that he was given at one point, but the crazy thing about that was his inheritance was literally just pushed. My understanding was almost completely just pushed into the research lab. It wasn't, and he was already using the private sector and like solving problems to be able to fund that. So as far as I know, almost everything that he did came straight out of just a private lab situation that he set up. And so I had in my trajectory, like behavior analysis is cool. This is really fucking cool once I got out of it. And then kind of realizing the landscape and the roles and how I didn't fit into that and what I wanted to do is like, could I start to develop a situation to where I could live off of things that are interesting to me, but start allocating more and more of my time over years to be able to focus back on the bigger questions. And so it's weird, like you can get with social media too, like you can get stuck in these loops of like creating the next video and now you're no longer spending time on the ultimate vision, which is to start allocating more time to get back there. So this is something I've been thinking like COVID situation on what it created economically from a business like rec stuff, but it gave me the situation to where I could start to reflect on that and start to plan on like, okay, how do I step back out of this? So something like closing down the podcast was like a no-brainer for me in the sense of like I need to start allocating time to learning these sort of things. Because yeah, social dilemma, behavior analytic research trends, the systems that we've set up for BCBAs and others to get into the field, like it's just all potentially because of who I'm talking to, but it's extremely clear that you need far more. You need far more skill sets, and you need to hang out with people that are trying to solve those problems, right? If we want to get back on track of saving the world with behavior analysis.
I'm legitimately afraid for democracy. Like, if I'm just going to be totally just, I mean, I'm not even joking. Like, it's not that irrational, like, Trumpaluffamuffagus like stuff. Like, he's a monster too. But I'm just saying, like, just in general, sense making in and of itself, the erosion of meta narratives and shared narratives, it creates the conditions of chaos to the point where I fear a reversion to a state of nature, and I kid not.
Oh yeah, no, same. I'm coming off of a couple books that Hank Green wrote that essentially is a very small sci-fi bent of what's going on in the world right now, and without giving any spoilers, like the concentration of power seems to just completely set up the conditions to explode a fucking society and like kill us all.
The amoral utilization of our science by people not governed by particular frameworks. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was an interview. God, what's the guy? I can't remember the guy who from The Big Sick. He also played the I can't remember Pakistani character in Silicon Valley. that actor. Anyway,
Sacha
I can't
Baron
remember his
Cohen?
name. Huh?
Sacha Baron Cohen?
No. He's God, I need to find his name. Let me find his. Anyway, the guy, he was one of the coders in Silicon Valley. He was the main character, and
Definitely not Sacha Baron Cohen.
and he was the main character.
Imagine
of the
if
Big
he
Sick.
like comes out and it turns out that's what he's been doing on the side the whole time.
No,
Relational
he did an
Density thing,
interview.
though, right? Like, I love his
He's
shit, so I'm like, oh, yeah,
surprisingly
fuck.
brilliant, though.
Anyway, he's brilliant. Yeah, Sacha Baron Cohen is. Oh my god. Anyway, long story short, he did an interview recently where they asked him like, "Hey, you guys, the whole show ends up being they produce this massive algorithm that ends up being so perfect that it could potentially destroy the world, and though it would make them trillionaires." And they have this moral moment, and the show ends with them destroying their own product and self-sabotaging so that they can save people from themselves. And he talked about how, as part of the show, they went out and got a chance to meet with different executives and coders and just like bigwigs in the Silicon Valley space. And he even says, I point blank asked them, to what degree do they consider the actual human impact of the things that they do, and like moral realities of it. And everyone in the room was astonished that he wasn't just totally amazed by how cool it was that they were doing, and that should have even been a consideration.
What?
Like that's how, because it's so amoral and it's just so driven towards producing the next perfect product.
This is like an
The
hour
next
of an
perfect
hour and a half
mathematical-
of the content in Social Dilemma is what you just described. Like that's
It just
Well,
blows
I mean,
my mind, though, because
this
it's
is
so
him describing his
cliche.
own experience. Sorry, Danielle, go ahead.
No, it's so cliche. Like, how could they not? How do you not think about these things? Like, there's infinite books, there's infinite shows, there's all these things about this. Why?
This is why I
Well,
was
I
asking
mean-
you the other day personally, Dimitri, about the ad revenue pushing and influencing these social media.
Or you mean like if I were king for the day, what would I do?
Yeah,
when you
that's
asked
what I
that
was talking about, because like I think my understanding, Danielle, is that they do talk about those sort of things, but at the end of the day, there's some economic forces and things that start to really push that that's not in the best interest of the company, even though these people may value it. I believe it's stated multiple times by the people in that doc that it was valued in there, but it was not the primary thing being talked about, because it's not, at the end of the day, what's actually being incentivized. What's incentivized is whatever will grow the platform, get more users on, get more engagement time, and sell more ads. So unless you can
Back
get
to
off that
social
ad-based
discounting
revenue.
curves.
And not
Right
just
back
social
to-
discounting,
Well,
but like
actually,
multi models of choice making. Like, you have the matching law, you have the social discounting, you have like all of like how do we account for all of it?
Well, and I think at some level, the AI algorithm eliminates the locus or the responsibility of the chooser. And so if I'm making a choice for an actual other person, then that social discounting curve is relevant. But if there's an algorithm that makes that choice for me, and there are dials that produce profits and not profits, and all I see are the profits, not profits, and I'm either going to be the person that's benefiting from that algorithm, or I'm the person being exploited from that algorithm, my only choice is what end of the algorithm. Eventually, the algorithm takes on a life of its own. The algorithm makes the choice, and I have no responsibility.
They're in the
It's-
You know
fishbowl.
almost-
what would be amazing? Oh, sorry.
It's
How
al-
amazing would it be if we had laws written to where the algorithms had to produce responding minimally within the parameters of our hyperbolic curve? How amazing would that be?
Embed
so you
social
need to
responsibility in the algorithm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like you have to have an algorithm that stays within the bounds of a hyperbolic curve so as to assume or as to embed and program towards social responsibility.
So in
And it responds
gambling,
to pressures. So like if you have a drought or something that creates a resource depletion, that algorithm starts to narrow, just like our own responding does, to protect the most basic things that we need in order for the
Exactly.
society to continue to function. But then as resources become plentiful, it responds like we do, and the social discount.
Some hope is restored.
my
Which is why we
understanding,
need scientists to run for fucking office. Because
my understanding with
when-
gambling is that there was identified schedules of reinforcement that would literally get anyone to pour their fucking pockets out. I don't care how strong-willed you think you are. And there was some of those that were actually banned as a result of that. Now,
Right.
I feel like there's hope for it, but yeah, like you need to get people with the scientific perspective to start influencing those
But I
sort
mean,
of things from the
what
inside.
I'm saying is
out.
that's how you could quantify a moral framework. Like, hey, listen, we know that decision making and responding, you can get people to respond on this particular kind of curve. If you have the right game in place and you have the right schedule set up, you can control their responding on this particular curve. And we are saying as a society, since we know this on a basic scientific level, our laws are that you are not permitted to program an algorithm that is designed to produce responding that exceeds this marker on the curve. Because if you do at that point, you're creating digital crack. And we can't have that because it's corrosive.
For real. And to bring it kind of full circle, I guess what you're proposing is this: morality is a model.
Exactly.
Morality is not an absolute. And if we can move away from morality as this kind of absolute internal thing that drives behavior, and morality is a model of a type of choice architecture, then we might be able to embed the solution in the problem.
Unbelievable.
Marvelous.
I think that's marvelous.
Marvelous.